Can I help?
It won't let me die. Nothing is allowed to die.
Now, if there's one genre I love more than any other, it is horror. How it draws you in with tension, or gives you a burst of adrenaline with each masterful scare, or sometimes just the plain old fantastic icons the genre carries with it. Now, with Halloween right around the corner, now seems like the best time to take a look at some horror titles from the gaming side of things that have been on my radar and see what they have in store.
Oh shit!
Like so many others, I have fond memories, or horrible ones depending on who you ask, with Frictional Games' Amnesia: The Dark Descent. How everything blended together into a healthy mix of thick atmosphere, great storytelling, and design that pushed players into situations where being on edge wasn't a possibility, it was guaranteed. So like everyone else, when Frictional announced SOMA, I was more than ready for another journey through darkest despair. And while it never came close to The Dark Descent's most intense scares, it was far from disappointing. SOMA follows Simon, a man volunteering for an experimental brain scan that could save him from a lethal brain injury, only to awaken from the procedure in a decaying facility where malformed creatures skulk about. Now he must find out what happened, how he got there, and a way to save himself. As a protagonist, Simon is a stranger in a strange land, a vocal everyman that's way in over their head and serves as an ideal vehicle for the player over the Dark Descent's silent protagonist Daniel. As he explores the Pathos 2 facility, the theme of existentialism and what it means to be takes center stage, and it's handled well and leads to some shocking moments and passive moral choices that first-time players will not see coming and will take their breath away, alongside a walking tour of solid environmental storytelling. It's a shame that this theme is at odds with other aspects of the story, specifically the horror itself and the monsters, which leads to an out-of-nowhere B-plot that diverts Simon away from the main story so he can destroy a thing. When this happens, it feels like you're playing the climax for a different draft for an earlier build of the game, but the devs realized the real ending for the current version was not enough to end on, or they put too much emphasis on the thing, so they decided to force an abridged version in, regardless of the fact it detracted from the overall narrative in the long run. It doesn't ruin the entirety of Soma's story, but it does make the ending and the third act feel completely unfocused, especially when the B-plot is kicked off 2/3 into the game by some random guy that just appears, and this lack of focus also carries over into the gameplay side of things. One of the things I loved about the Dark Descent's level design was how, despite being linear, it still demanded that you explore in a non-linear fashion, going into different areas of your own volition, whereas SOMA, it's considerably more linear. There are still some open-ended areas you're free to explore for environmental storytelling or just idle curiosity, but you are very much heading down a linear track, with long distances between run-ins with monsters, which makes it feel like Frictional has taken some cues from the walking simulators that have come out in the meantime. But the gameplay is still what it is in the dev's prior stuff, for better or worse, and it got the job done then and it still does now, and even when it does feel more like a walking sim, there's enough interaction to help remind you that's not what you're playing. But of course, the real question that needs to be answered, is this game scary? Yes, but it's not the most terrifying. In fact, while playing, there were numerous instances where, even after I encountered some monsters, I was just not scared. But as you progress, everything from the squalor and claustrophobia of Pathos 2, the grisly monster designs, and the great sound design start to slowly click together. And the fear factor gets ramped up from the Nightmare on Elm Street remake to Blair Witch Project levels. As I said earlier, the scares don't reach the same level as the dev's earlier work, but like Machine for Pigs, not only does SOMA get under your skin, but it scrapes at your muscles underneath.
Brace for impact! Hold on, the blast just pushed us off the plateau!
What does that mean?
SOMA has a lot to offer. It's just a shame so much of what it offers is at odds with the rest of it, but in spite of that, comes away as a great showcase of terror and Frictional's writing chops. Don't go into this expecting another masterpiece, but a solid follow-up to a horror classic. Something I hope I can say in regards to the next game in this showcase, Unlucky 7.
Don't worry, I'll make it quick.
Oh god!
her.
Now this is a game I've had on my radar for some time, more out of the history surrounding its development and its evolution leading up to release. Unlucky 7 was originally announced as an RPG Maker project that would go on to languish in development hell, until it was taken up by Puzzling Dream and Ultimate Games, who've reworked it into a point-and-click adventure game. The end result doesn't offer anything on par with the likes of Barrow Hill or Darkfall, but it still manages some out there stuff that are guaranteed to make the squeamish squirm. Unlucky 7 follows a group of friends on their way to a birthday party at a luxury motel on a distant planet, where they'll eat, drink, and of course get wasted, unaware that the organisers are part of a group of cannibals on the dark web, looking for some all-new meat donors for their web series, and the partygoers must struggle to escape the planet or end up someone's next meal. Right off the bat, this is a solid premise for a suspense story that had the potential for some nail-biting, tense scenes, which is undermined by poor English translation. It's not so bad that you can't understand what people are talking about or what's going on, but there's a lot of grammar and phrasing that's just off, and dialogue that's redundant. I'm talking Jeff's mum hugged Jeff type of conversations, and it doesn't help that the characters are rather flat. Don't go into this game expecting fleshed out characters with development over its short length. What you see is what you get, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means it's impossible to really have a connection with these characters. So when something bad happens to them, this is the primary reaction you're gonna have running through your head. Huh. That happened. Gameplay is pretty much what you'd expect from a Telltale adventure title. You move the character around the environment, pick up necessary items, and solve puzzles with some minigames mixed in for good measure. For what it's worth, this is fine. The puzzles demand some thought rooted in decent logic from the player, and they never go into the realms of moon logic. They make sense given the immediate environment, and the chapters are short, so the puzzles never drag on for too long. The minigames, on the other hand, they're not too hot. They're not terrible, just repetitive and limited in number. There's only 2 of them, pipe matching and obstacle dodging, and they get boring by the second half of the game since you've been doing them again and again. It's practically like the Small World ride at Disneyland, except it's not bad at first. However, there has been one thing that's been pulled off without a hitch: the visuals. The game's graphics are gorgeous. Puzzling Dream went for a stylized voxel aesthetic with some sprite work mixed in. Couple this with the bright color scheme, and it really makes the game pop out of the monitor. Not to mention, it helps play into the scenes where the game is trying to be scary. I won't lie, there was never a time in this game where I was scared, but there were plenty of times where I was drawn in by what was playing out in front of me. This is because the stylized graphics, the limited animations, and the sound design all come together to create a tone that's reminiscent of David Lynch, where your mind just goes wild and creates the more visceral details that the visuals alone can't convey. It wasn't enough to scare me, but it was enough of a reward to make me want to keep playing all the way through to the end. This doesn't mean though that I enjoyed my time with it through and through. This game is full of all sorts of glitches and bugbears that not only annoy, but firmly put this in the category of Eurojank. During my time with Unlucky 7, I encountered things like a character's walk cycle looping endlessly, thus preventing a scene from playing and progressing the story, various random graphical glitches that made things look odd, and an issue with the core gameplay, where after interacting with something, a character will just turn away from it, forcing you to take a step away and turn around so you can interact with it again. I know this doesn't sound like much, but trust me, this stacks up, especially when you have to interact with one thing multiple times to solve a puzzle. But what stuck out to me more than anything else was the character designs. In the game's trailers and promo material, anthropomorphic or furry designs are featured primarily, yet you can choose for each character to be either an anthropomorph or a human. I don't really get why this choice is present, since the game never really goes into the finer details of its universe or any relevant details. The only answer I can come up with is that this was a misguided attempt to give the game wider appeal, since this is a niche product and it's only going to appeal to a handful of people in general. There's also the English voice acting, which is god-awful, and it makes the cast of Two Worlds 1 sound like Oscar nominees. Thankfully, you can turn the voice acting off, and if you check this game out, I recommend leaving it as such.
Hey. Hey.
Now let's close out this segment with the last thing there is to say. Unlucky 7 is an early access title. It's not finished. The devs were honest about how this game needed more work, but understood there were people who had been waiting years for this game, dating back to the RPG Maker version that was abandoned. So rather than leave them in the lurch after a literal last minute delay, they put it out in early access to get feedback and make improvements. Their commitment to ensuring this does end up a solid product is commendable, even if a finalized full release would have been preferable, but what is in the version currently available does paint an optimistic future for this game. When it's done, it should be a more refined and coherent product that I can recommend looking into. For now though, it's better for you to wait for it to graduate from early access. Unlike the last game in this showcase, Blair Witch.
What is this?
Now this game was the one I was most eager to try out for this showcase, Blair Witch by Bloober Team, mainly because I was curious how the layers of Fear devs would translate the 90s horror classic into the video game realm, and I've gotta admit, I ended up enjoying this a lot more than SOMA. But that doesn't mean this came away as the objectively better title, but it sure gave it a run for its money. Taking place well after the Blair Witch Project, this game follows the misadventures of Ellis and his support dog Bullet, as they take part in the search for a young boy who's disappeared into the Black Hills woods. But things aren't what they appear to be, and Ellis will be forced to confront demons within and around him. A nice setup for a solid story that makes great use of the film's cinematic lore to not only add a variety of environments beyond just creepy woods, but also explores the theme of PTSD with Ellis, which he got during the Gulf War. At times, the story does focus too much on his PTSD over, well, the Blair Witch, but it still keeps things tight and concise with everything being tied back to her, unlike SOMA where it felt like two different narratives were happening at once and fighting for the spotlight. With the exception of Ellis, the small cast of characters isn't very fleshed out. How you treat Bullet will affect his personality as well as the ending, but he's not the most compelling of characters. He serves his purpose as a vehicle for the player first and is solid protagonist second. A much bigger issue though with the story is the ending itself.
Oh, God, it's freezing. It's better be worth it.
Which one you get can be determined by rudimentary actions that most people will do first time round out of instinct. So 10 times out of 10, if you're a first time player, you're practically guaranteed to get the bad ending. If nothing else, this at least gives the player a reason to replay the game, but when the conditions can be so arbitrary, it can be frustrating when you know what cost you the ending you would have preferred, and it was just something so minuscule that any other game wouldn't have taken notice of. The gameplay itself is rooted very firmly in walking simulator territory, but unlike SOMA, feels like a solid evolution from what the devs did earlier. A curious addition has been Bloober's first foray into combat, and this is easily the weakest mechanic in the game, since it all boils down to is just shining a torch at enemies until they either go away or die. Enemy encounters with the witch's minions are pretty tense thanks to the atmosphere, but the combat is barely anything, and after your first couple of encounters it loses a lot of its allure. However, the other gameplay additions on the other hand turned out great. Throughout the game you'll come across videotapes that can alter reality as you rewind or fast forward through the footage. This lends itself well to some great puzzles and exploration. The other mechanic is also Bullet himself. He can be used to browse the environment for certain collectibles that only he can find, or acquire items in areas too small for you to reach. He also points out enemy locations in combat, so he's a versatile companion. His presence does hurt a sense of isolation that would have added to the game's fear factor, but this is made up for, since how you treat Bullet and react to him will have an impact on the ending, and he does add an emotional core to what we the player see and do in the story. On top of that, you can also pet him, and he's just so damn cute. There are some other things as well, such as being able to play on Ellis's phone and prank call a pizza shop, and even play Snake, shockingly enough. That was actually a real highlight in the game for me, just being able to play that. There's all sorts of nice little additions like that that really does help make the game feel more alive.
Ready to order?
Sorry, no.
Well, pizza off then.
But of course, the big question that needs to be answered is whether or not the game is scary. Yes, but it could have been so much more. See, the game has so much working for it in regards to being creepy, from the beautiful environments, the sound design, and the thick atmosphere. But it's all undermined by the culmination of different factors, from when the story focuses too much on Alice's PTSD, the poor combat, and Bullet keeping you company. But it's the graphical glitches and bugs that really mar the game's potential for immersion. Nothing breaks you out of an experience like things bugging out or shadows having seizures, and it all really hurts the game's ability to scare the player. In spite of this, the game at least manages to get under your skin and give you a good spine tingler like Vincent Price.
I don't understand. Emmett. Oh god.
Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Blair Witch. It was full of original ideas on the part of Bloober Team and did the property justice. It's not the scariest game. That title goes to 2000's Blair Witch Rust and Par, but it has plenty to offer fans of the movies and horror, and I hope it does well enough for Bloober Team to have a crack at a sequel. And hopefully they take inspiration from Condemned. That would be just amazing. Boy, those games sure were creepy, weren't they? I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you really liked it, then please, by all means, feel free to subscribe. As for the next game review, I'm going to be taking a look at the all-new expansion for Destiny 2, Shadowkeep, as well as taking a look at some of the features of the all-new free-to-play relaunch of the game. As for movie reviews, up next, I'll have my review of It Chapter 2 and Shanghai Fortress. I'm a little behind on things thanks to being bogged down at work last week, hence why this video was late, but please be patient, I'll get as many videos done as possible before I head off for PAX this weekend. I've got all that and more coming up, so please stick around.